With us tonight, we have Brian Schwingle from the Minnesota DNR. He is the Forest Health Program Coordinator, and he was gracious enough to join us this evening. So, yeah, if you could all make sure that you're muted during the presentation, that would be great. And yeah, we will. I'll hand it over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Sounds good. Well, I appreciate the invitation from Hennepin County here to speak about a little forest health. And so this is going to be a crash course on 4 issues, basically. And I think that will be probably 3 more issues than what is advised in terms of learning stuff over the course of an hour, but I'll give it a go here. So here's the agenda. I'm going to talk about drought, oak wilt, Dutch elm disease, and emerald ash borer. Before I get started, though, boy, I would like, excuse me, I'd like to figure out how to hide this little ribbon on top, but maybe it's not that big of a deal. It shouldn't hide too many things. So this is the team I'm a part of. We're a small team. We have 4 regional specialists that you can read their names there, and then I coordinate the team. And kind of our bread and butter, what we do is we investigate large-scale forest health mysteries, almost exclusively in Minnesota's rural forests, and typically for professional foresters. So we get around and we see a lot of things bothering trees. And we also monitor large-scale forest health over time. We get a federal grant from the U.S. Forest Service to do so, and we primarily do this in airplanes. And we generate a lot of data when we fly over large patches of damaged forests. We map that out, and then we can track things over time, like a native insect called spruce budworm. And so in a way, you can kind of think of us like the CDC for the forests. So moving on to the first topic here, drought. There's been a lot of drought lately. These are maps that the DNR climate team generates, and the areas in red or brown circled here indicate those specific areas in the growing season. So April through September, they experienced one of the 19 driest growing seasons on the record going back to 1895. So you can see a lot of areas in Minnesota have experienced drought in the last decade. And when I take a look at the state as a whole, 2021's growing season was the 11th driest growing season on record, and 2023 was the 9th driest growing season on record for the entire state. When you take a look at just east central Minnesota, or like the 7-county metro, basically, we've experienced 4 consecutive below normal precipitation growing seasons, 4 straight years of drought. And it's certainly showing in our trees. Trees need water. I think it's weird, but I feel like there's like this disconnect in our society with forests and then with like gardens or annual crops, where I get this feeling that people think that forests are just kind of immune from flooding or extremely dry spells, and they aren't. Trees need water. And if you take home anything from this talk tonight, this is it. If it would kill you to lose a tree in your yard, water it. Buy a drip hose that you can see the strip hose on the bottom there. You want to put it around the drip line of your tree. That's straight under the edge of your tree. And you want to turn that drip hose on like once a week when we're in drought. Turn it on once a week and let it run for several hours. Trees need a lot of water. But you don't water a tree like you water grass. You water a tree infrequently, and you need to soak the soil well underneath that grass rooting zone. And if you're able to do that, you will be able to avoid a lot of complications that arise from drought. Another thing, what a drought-stressed tree does not need is it does not need fertilizer. I recommend only applying fertilizer to trees if you get a soil analysis, and a soil analysis from, for example, the University of Minnesota Soils Testing Lab. If they indicate that your soils are actually in need of certain nutrients. Otherwise, I wouldn't fertilize trees. Last comment on this, if you've paid an arborist to treat one of your trees, maybe you've paid somebody to treat your tree for Dutch elm disease prevention or two-line chestnut borer prevention on oaks. I would think that if you're investing money to treat those trees, you would also ensure that those trees in particular are watered. Because, for example, let's take ash. If you hire somebody to inject an ash tree with a chemical to prevent emerald ash borer attack, that chemical does not prevent a root disease that attacks roots when that ash tree is very drought stressed. So watering can go a long ways in preventing all kinds of problems. We're seeing a tremendous amount of oaks died in a scattered fashion all across Minnesota. We've seen this for the last 2 years, from the southern border up to the northwestern tip of the state. And the main point here is that if an oak dies and its dead leaves stay up in the canopy during the growing season for a couple months, that is almost certainly a complication from drought and not oak wilt, which I'm going to cover about now. Quick timeout to ask Joseph or Dustin if they know how I can shrink this zoom control bar on top of my screen. Any ideas? And can you see that?
I can't.
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty slick.
Can't see it either.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Yep, sorry. I don't have anything, any Zoom tips, sorry.
Oh, I see. I'm going to click this hide floating meeting controls. There we go. All right, now I can see my whole screen. Okay, so going to cover oak wilt now. Basics of oak wilt. Oak wilt is a disease. It's caused by a pathogen, a fungal pathogen, and that fungal pathogen, it's currently thought, and it's been thought for the last couple decades, that it is not native to the United States. Oak wilt is what I would call drastically fatal to our red oak species. We have several red oak species in the state. We kind of divide our oaks into two groups, the red oak group and the white oak group. The red oak group is drastically susceptible to oak wilt. How you identify your different oak groups is that the red oaks have sharply pointed leaves, like you can see on that leaf on the left, whereas the white oak group, so we have swamp white oak, and bur oak, they have rounded leaf edges. So that's how you tell the difference. Oak wilt's been present in Minnesota since the 1940s. But as you can see on that map on the left, it hasn't spread yet to cover even half of the state. It's a very inefficient mover. The stars kind of have to align for oak wilt infection to occur. For reasons I'll hopefully explain in a little bit, oak wilt can be prevented to a pretty high degree in an almost free way. That distinguishes oak wilt from just about every single other invasive species in the state of Minnesota. There are no resistant red oaks that we're aware of. So those are the basics. Now I'm going to talk about how to recognize oak wilt. The initial symptom, if a tree has oak wilt, is that the trees at the outer edge of the canopy, they kind of fade, they turn off green and then brown, and then they rapidly drop off the tree. So the picture on the bottom left shows a series of bur oak leaves showing the wide variety of like green retention, green color retention that you'll find in fallen leaves if they have oak wilt. The picture in the upper left of that red oak, that's actually a northern pin oak, which is a type of red oak, that shows textbook leaf discoloration caused by oak wilt. And then the picture on the right, if you see that like on your driveway or a sidewalk in the middle of summer and there are oak leaves everywhere, and this landowner was, I'm sure, was blowing leaves off of his driveway, that is a very solid indicator of oak wilt. So this is the best symptom to recognize oak wilt, rapid leaf drop. Kind of an advanced symptom, like if you're a professional arborist or something, you might look for gray to black streaking on the surface of the wood of symptomatic branches. And in cross section, it looks like a bunch of little dots going around the circumference of the cut stem, like you can see on the left. On red oaks, like I said, it's drastically fatal. They die in 1 to 2 months. And so here's a picture actually in Dakota County where over the course of a little over 2 months, this oak started showing symptoms in mid-June, and by the end of August, it was dead. Nothing else does that to red oaks besides possibly a lightning strike. And if a lightning strike strikes your oak, you're gonna know because usually the bark blows off of one side. Now, moving on to bur oaks. Bur oaks, actually, bur oak is the most numerous tree in Minnesota if you only look at trees over, I think it's 17 inches diameter at about head height. So, in other words, most of our big trees are bur oaks in this state. Bur oak is pretty susceptible to oak wilt. If a bur oak gets oak wilt, it's going to die over the course of 1 to 7 years. It's not drastically fatal like it is with our red oaks, but they die. So in here you can see kind of what happens. Similar symptoms, you get rapid leaf drop, but instead of the whole crown, it'll occur on 1 to 2 branches. And then with our white oaks, they'll die in a much slower way, over 1 to 20 years. And some white oaks can recover from like a light infection. This oak here, which I photographed near Winona, this is a white oak, and that's not going to recover. That's dying from oak wilt. Another symptom that you see, or sign that you see on about half of red oaks that die of oak wilt, is you get this spore mat that forms under the bark, and it grows this fungal cushion that actually kind of smells like bananas in the middle of that mat, and it'll pop the bark open sometimes. So if you see that, you got oak wilt. Now, this is how oak wilt works. 90% of oak wilt movement is through from one oak to another through connected roots called root grafts. So you can see a picture of root grafts on the right, where trees of the same species or very closely related species, they'll actually graft, their roots will fuse. And so if this tree on the left dies of oak wilt, the oak wilt pathogen quickly gets into the root system. And if it hits a root graft, it'll move right into the next oak and kill it. So over time in the woods, you get these expanding pockets of death in our oak forests. And in somebody's yard, you'll see the same thing. If it has multiple oaks in it, it'll just kill one oak after the other because it's in the root system. But of course, about 10% of oak wilt movement is actually, the pathogen is actually moved by a sap beetle. So remember those spore mats I talked about? Sap beetles smell those. They're attracted to them. And then they're also attracted to fresh wounds. And they inadvertently deposit those spores, and then you get wilt and death. But again, this kind of review, the easiest indicator, the best indicator of oak wilt is rapid and total leaf drop on red oaks. Look at all those leaves. That's June 30th on a trail in Lebanon Hills Regional Park. See all those leaves on the trail? That's oak wilt. Okay. Now, there are a few lookalikes, particularly when we're talking about bur oaks or white oaks. Bur oak blight is a fungal leaf disease that you can see on the left. Notice how the most severe symptoms are in the lower canopy, and the top of the tree looks fine. That tree on the left was taken in early September. Next spring, it will look totally fine. And trees with bur oak blight can live for a long time. We don't know how long they can live for, because we've only known about bur oak blight for about 20, 30 years. But it looks much worse than it is. But here's the difference. Disease progression is opposite with bur oak blight versus oak wilt. Bur oak blight is not fatal at all. Oak wilt is. Two-line chestnut borer is a native insect borer that really likes to attack stressed oaks, like drought stressed oak. We're seeing outbreaks of two-line chestnut borer all over Minnesota right now. Usually two-line chestnut borer takes a couple years to kill red oaks. So you'll get this dead red-green appearance in the canopy, whereas with oak wilt on a red oak, it dies over the course of 1 month. You get rapid leaf drop. Two-line chestnut borer, those leaves stick up in the canopy. But I do want to tell you, diagnosing oak health is not easy. All these pictures here look a lot like oak wilt, but none of it's oak wilt. And so a main message is, if you're in doubt, you can collect a sample, or you could hire an arborist to collect a sample for you and submit it to the plant disease clinic at the University of Minnesota. I highly, highly recommend, if you are considering investing in any sort of oak wilt management on bur oaks or white oaks, before you make that investment, I highly recommend you get a lab confirmation of oak wilt, because there are a lot of lookalikes. It's expensive to control, but like I said, kind of closer to the beginning of the presentation, prevention is frequently free. You just don't need to wound your oaks April through July, and you'll avoid infection, because you need to get above ground infection. You need a wound. Now, of course, Mother Nature wounds trees a lot. We can't really do anything about that. But humans also wound trees a lot. Just think about somebody like nailing something up to the tree, pruning, hitting the base of a tree with a lawnmower, using a weed whipper a little too aggressively and biting into the cambium of the tree, busting through the bark. I've seen dogs tied to oaks, and puppies like chewing away at the trunk bark of young oaks, opening up wounds that get infected with oak wilt. I've seen horses walking on trails where the surface roots of the trees are going across the trail, and the horse's hooves clip the roots and rub the bark off, and you get oak wilt. Any wound can get infected, so we can avoid a lot of that. The other thing too is if you have to prune for whatever reason, sometimes you have to prune. If you put a tree wound paint on that wound, on that pruning cut within a few minutes, that, as long as it dries, that prevents oak wilt 100%. Okay, so people can pay an expert professional, an arborist, to inject a chemical called propiconazole. Like, a trade name for propiconazole is Alamo. Injecting a healthy oak with propiconazole will protect it from above ground oak wilt infection for 2 years. So every other year, if you want to protect an oak, you're going to have to pay someone to inject it. Highly effective. I also want to let you know that many cities throughout Minnesota, they have ordinances which aim to protect the overall urban forest. And oak wilt ordinances are quite common. So here are some examples that you might find in your city ordinance code. Maybe the city says no one can prune oaks April through July. It might say something like maybe no pruning of oaks April through July unless you apply a pruning paint to those wounds. They might mark your trees if they have oak wilt and write you a letter and say you have to cut this down and dispose of this properly before the next April. Otherwise, we might do it and then we're going to charge you. Some cities might have an ordinance that says if you have a pile of fresh oak firewood, you have to tarp that from April through July. They can take many different shapes and forms, these city ordinances. I think this is my last slide on oak wilt. Big warning here. Cutting down oaks does not stop the disease. Usually. If you have, so for example, if you have 3 oaks in your yard and one gets oak wilt, cutting down the tree with oak wilt won't stop the disease at all because the disease is going to get into the root system and spread underground. Control is possible. There are different ways to control oak wilt, but it's complicated and well beyond the scope of this talk. Okay, so that brings me to Dutch elm disease 623. Not bad. Are there any questions?
I'll just say that this is really significant. I'm a big hiker and I spend a lot of time in the woods, and I've studied trees. I love trees and I've seen a lot of this. And again, of course I can't identify it, but it certainly looks familiar, and it's really helpful to have this knowledge. Because my only question would be is if you are, say, if you're in a state park, county parks and that kind of thing, and you notice that a tree seems ill, is there a process to notify the forestry about that?
That's a great question. And thanks. I'm glad you're appreciating this. So I work for the state government, Department of Natural Resources. And when it comes to oak wilt, we are the authority on tracking where it's at. And since oak wilt has been in the southeastern Minnesota and the metro since the early 40s, and it's just slowly spreading north, we aren't interested in getting reports of oak wilt in this area that I'm showing in the maroon zone. But if anyone is recreating or visiting a friend or visiting a state park, county park, whatever, at the periphery, particularly up north, in these hashed areas, we definitely want reports of any likely oak wilt. Now, I would say the way to do that would be there's an app called the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, GLEDEN app. It's funny, if you have an Android and you go onto the Google Play Store, you have to type in the acronym, not the real name for the app. It's goofy. Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, GLEDN. And with that app, you can take pictures and your phone records a latitude and longitude. And then those reports actually go to me or one of my coworkers. So yeah, that would be helpful. Alternatively, if you highly suspect oak wilt at the periphery there of the range and you're in a state park, you could absolutely just let the park manager know or whoever's in charge, and they would probably check it out. And if they thought it was oak wilt, they would probably report it to somebody like me. It's a good
Great,
question.
thank you for that. I did write down that app, and I have GLEDN.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. And Joseph or Dustin, maybe one of you could put in a link to Minnesota Department of Ag's Arrest the Pest website, where you can report all kinds of invasive species. And I forget if they've changed the name of it from Arrest the Pest, but I think it's something like that. There's another app that is called EDD Maps Midwest, EDD MAPS Midwest, that would also work for reporting oak wilt. All right. Pausing for one more question. All right, I'll move on. Dutch elm disease. Well, as you might guess, Dutch elm disease is a non-native fungal pathogen, sound familiar, of elms. I believe we have 3 elms in Minnesota. The most common one is called American elm. American elms used to line boulevards of US cities, and they formed this lovely arching canopy over a lot of our cities. And when Dutch elm disease came into any area, it pretty much wiped out all of those out. I'd say in Minnesota, we're lucky that I know Minneapolis has still a decent population of really big, beautiful American elms. And they've maintained those through a rigorous sanitation program, and I'll describe that in a little bit. But Dutch elm disease, everything I said about oak wilt, a lot of it applies to Dutch elm disease. It's fatal to all of our elms. Here's a picture, if you aren't familiar with elm, here's a picture on the left of the leaves. Notice the base of the leaf where it attaches to the stem. It's asymmetrical. One side is lower than the other. It's a really good indicator of like an American elm. So Dutch elm disease, it's been present in Minnesota since 1961. Unlike oak wilt, there's a big difference here. The disease moves a lot more efficiently. Like I said, with oak wilt, the stars kind of have to align for disease to occur, infection to occur above ground. With Dutch elm disease, it's not like that. It moves very efficiently. So, oak wilt, it's been here since the 1940s, and it still has yet to cover 50% of Minnesota. Whereas with Dutch elm disease, between 1961 and roughly like 1985, it spread over every county in the state minus, I think, 2. And now, of course, those 2 have had Dutch elm disease since. So it spread very quickly. But I guess some positive news is that there are actually American elms that have been found, like growing out in the wild, that have been found to be totally tolerant of Dutch elm disease. And you can go to tree nurseries around the Twin Cities and find at least 1, if not 2 or 3 or 4 of those resistant American elms, which are cloned. And when they're cloned and sold in the nursery trade, they're called cultivars. So that's kind of a positive story. Actually, a pretty famous arborist from Minnesota discovered a resistant American elm just east of the Twin Cities. I think it was over in Stillwater on the river bluff, and they made that into a cultivar, and that's called, Dustin or Joseph, you might have to help me. I believe it's called the St. Croix elm.
It is the St. Croix elm. Yes,
Yeah,
it was
so-
found in Afton State Park.
Yes, like how cool is that? It's kind of like Minnesota's own, so something to be proud of. So this is how you recognize Dutch elm disease. You basically get 1 branch or 2 branch flagging. You'll read that term on websites or hear like professionals mention that, your tree is flagging. What that means is your branch is wilting and the leaves on it are turning color. So the leaves turn off green and then yellow and then kind of crispy brown. And sometimes you get pretty heavy leaf drop. And of course, the disease spreads around the crown. So it might start off on 1 or 2 branches, but eventually, like you can see on this picture on the left, spreads around the crown. And just like with oak wilt, although this is easier to see on elms, if you scrape away the bark very lightly on a wilting branch and to expose the outer wood, you will see grayish or brownish streaking if it has Dutch elm disease. And that right there is pretty much the definitive field diagnostic for professionals. Sometimes you'll get rapid mortality on some individual elms. Other elms, it might take a couple years for them to die or even more. So another thing that you can find on an elm that's died of American elm, or an elm that's died of Dutch elm disease, is you'll find signs or indications of bark beetle feeding. So bark beetles are really tiny beetles. They're like the size of a rice grain, and their immature stage, called the larvae, they form these radiating feeding tunnels, like you can see on the left. You see that the big vertical tunnel was made by the female, by the mother. She laid all her eggs down the edges of that vertical tunnel. And then those eggs hatched. The baby larvae, they ate their way perpendicular to the mother's egg laying gallery. And so there are a few different bark beetle species that carry the Dutch elm disease pathogen to healthy American elms, and that's how they get infected. When the adult beetles emerge from the tree, they leave these very tiny exit holes, like you can see on the right. So those people's fingers are pointing to those very tiny exit holes. So if you see an elm and it's dead and you go up to it and you see bark beetle feeding tunnels, and they're called galleries like this, you can almost be assured that that elm was killed by Dutch elm disease. So this is how it works. Again, you get an elm that died from Dutch elm disease. And these bark beetles, they're attracted to stressed and dying and recently killed elms. They actively bore into the tree and they pick up the disease spores, and then they fly and they might feed on the twigs of a healthy elm, and that's how they transfer the disease. But very much like oak wilt, Dutch elm disease pathogen will also get into the root systems and spread from elm to elm through grafted roots. This underground movement of Dutch elm disease, this is actually the minority of cases. So like maybe 10% of the disease spreads through the roots, whereas 90% of Dutch elm disease moves above ground. Whereas with oak wilt, it's the opposite. But I'm not quizzing you, so it's not, you don't need to get worried about remembering that or not. Just like with oak wilt, there is a way that you can hire a professional to inject a certain chemical into an elm to protect it from above ground Dutch elm disease. And because, if I owned a majestic, big American elm, I would seriously consider doing this, even though for me, I think for a lot of people, these treatments, they're expensive. But of course, like, a 150-year-old, 120-year-old tree, it's almost irreplaceable. It's special. So, and the other thing is Dutch elm disease, it moves very efficiently. It doesn't need a wound to infect a tree. Every year that you have an American elm and it's not getting infected with Dutch elm disease, you're just lucky. Generally speaking, of course, there's some resistance out there, but you're probably just lucky. So I consider that a trade name for that complicated chemical name there, thiobendazole, is Arbotect. So again, just like with oak wilt, there are these city ordinances that your city might have to try and reduce the impact of Dutch elm disease in the area. Mandating elm removal within 20 days. Or maybe disease is moving slower in your elm, so maybe they aren't going to mandate your elm be removed until the following April. And then mandating elm firewood removal. Different cities around have different ordinances that are trying to protect the city's elm population. Same exact warning as oak wilt. If you have, now, the thing is, it's not like elms are very common in people's yards anymore, particularly outside the metro. It's quite rare. But if you ever were in a situation where you had two elms, or maybe your neighbor had an elm on their property within like 40 feet of your elm, up to 60 feet, you could just have disease transfer through the roots. So that's something to be aware of. All right. Going pretty good here. My last topic is going to be emerald ash borer. So are there any questions, one or two, about Dutch elm disease? Otherwise, I'll just boogie on. All righty. Moving on to emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer. So Dutch elm disease and oak wilt, they share a lot of similar characteristics, and those characteristics are easy to confuse. Emerald ash borer is a different ball game. It is a non-native beetle that attacks our ash trees, and it's fatal to all of our ash trees. Minnesota has 3 ash species: white ash, which naturally wouldn't grow in the Twin Cities area, wouldn't grow in Hennepin County, I don't think. Green ash and black ash. Minnesota has more ash trees than any other state in the country. So it's not a good thing for Minnesota that we got emerald ash borer here. This is a picture of an ash leaf on the left. I should have added another picture too. Kind of an easy way to identify ash trees is that they have those compound leaves, like you can see on the left, and those leaves pop out opposite one another on a twig. So not many of our trees grow their leaves opposite one another, but like ash does. And of course maple, but maple leaves don't look anything like ash. Emerald ash borer has been in Minnesota. It was first discovered in St. Paul in 2009. And the following year, it was discovered in the far southeastern corner in 2010. And, fast forward 14 years, the map on the left shows the green zones show where you have general infestation of ash trees. That's not to say that all of the ash trees in that area are dead, not even close. But generally speaking, emerald ash borer is common in those green zones. Attack, kind of like with Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer is a very efficient mover. I mean, look at its spread over the last 14 years. It gets around. It doesn't need a wound to attack the tree. The tree doesn't need to be weak to be attacked. I guess the good news is that scientists are finding some ash trees out east, so like Michigan, Ohio, that look like they could have some resistance genes. We're talking way less than 1% of all ash, but still, if you take a look at all of the ash trees in Minnesota, gosh, I wish I had that number off the top of my head. It might be 1 billion. It's a lot. I mean, if 0.01% of them were tolerant to emerald ash borer, that's still quite a few. So that's kind of good. All right, so recognition. How do you recognize emerald ash borer? Well, you look for woodpecker feeding. At first, that woodpecker feeding is going to be in the upper canopy branches, because emerald ash borer, they're attracted to light. They tend to attack trees in the upper canopy. So this tree, actually, this was in front of my old office on Warner Road in St. Paul. That tree is infested with emerald ash borer, and it's probably been infested for 2 to 3 years. Looks pretty good, right? But on a canopy branch, I looked up, I saw this woodpecker feeding. See how it goes through the bark to the wood, because those woodpeckers are feeding on the immature emerald ash borer, the larvae, under the bark. And actually to the right of the arrow, in the bigger patch of wood that's exposed, you can see the feeding tunnel of the emerald ash borer larva. So eventually that woodpecker feeding intensifies. And actually the picture I showed on the right here, this is just my neighbor's ash tree. This actually isn't very intense. It gets very intense. So much so that on green ash trees, it almost looks like the bark looks almost white because there's so much woodpecker feeding. All of the dark gray outer bark will be chipped off and you'll just be left with the light inner bark. So that's after 2 years, at least after 2 years of infestation. Sometimes cracks develop, particularly on our thin-barked ash tree, which is black ash. So barks will develop over feeding galleries. And then eventually the crown will thin, like you can see on this poor little ash here in southeastern Minnesota, and then the ash tree dies. And it'll die in central and southern Minnesota for about 4 to 6 years after the initial infestation. So it doesn't die as quick as with Dutch elm disease or oak wilt. It dies slower. If you're wondering if your tree has emerald ash borer and it has woodpecker feeding, the thing to do is to pry back the bark. I mean, if it has woodpecker feeding, you'll probably find an area on the bark to pry back. Maybe you could chip it back a little bit with some sort of wedge or like a little hatchet or something. And if you see these twisty feeding tunnels, that's emerald ash borer. Twisty feeding tunnels everywhere. They wind back and forth like you can see on the right, and you might be able to see a larva. This is a blown up picture. They get about 1.5 inches long. They have those body segments that are like bell shaped, and then they have those two little spiky things on the end. That's an emerald ash borer larva. That's what they look like. Those spiky things won't sting you, don't worry. When the adults emerge out of the tree, they leave these characteristic emergence holes that are flat on one side. So if they're oriented just right, they look like a D. But you can see on my fingers are pointing both to 2 exit holes, and you'll notice that they're flat on one side. So here's where emerald ash borer it was first discovered in Minnesota in 2009 and 2010. I'm going to fast forward to 2023 and show you all the kind of the isolated, like remote finds of emerald ash borer in 2023. So you can see we found quite a bit kind of isolated new finds in 2023 in central Minnesota, western Minnesota, and even northern Minnesota. For the first time, we found it on federal U.S. national forest land in northern Minnesota. This should not surprise anybody. We expect this. But so the map, so this is an older map, by the way. But so the map looks really bad, and it's bad. But when you take a look at local spread, so this is actually Southeast Metro. You can see this is Egan right here. When you take a look at the initial detection in Egan and look at where it spread to and look at the years it took to get there, that's about a half mile per year spread. And actually, this is true too. If you can see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can, in Stearns County. So kind of up toward like southwest of St. Cloud, if you know where St. Cloud is. So it's not just the metro where it was moving, at least at first at half mile a year. It's in rural central Minnesota too. I expect the spread to be even slower up north. But here's what I recommend for Hennepin County. So Hennepin County has had emerald ash borer for quite some time now. Chances are, if you have an ash or you used to have an ash or your ash is infested right now, chances are very, very good. But if you're still dealing with this, I recommend the first thing, everybody in the metro area, the first thing they should do if they're wondering what to do about their ash is they should do an internet search of their city and emerald ash borer, because your city might have something to tell you about emerald ash borer. I know some metro communities actually have like if their citizens hire a arborist to treat their ash to protect it, they might get a better deal if they go through a certain company because they live in a certain in that community. So I recommend doing that. Again, if I owned one tree and it shaded my roof that faced south or southwest and it cooled my house in the summer and it reduced my energy costs because of that, I would seriously consider treating an ash tree that shaded my south or southwest facing roof. And I would personally hire somebody to treat it with a chemical called emamectin benzoate. One common, like a trade name of emamectin benzoate is Treeage, Treeage, with the 2 dots over the A sometimes. That treatment will protect a healthy ash tree for 2 to 3 years. If you own like a little wood patch in somewhere in the state, if you own a black ash swamp, I would consider planting other tree species in canopy gaps before emerald ash borer arrives, ideally, and I'd protect those planted seedlings or saplings from deer browse. And I diversify the forest. You could consider in a wet zone, you could consider planting a Dutch elm disease tolerant American elm. You could consider planting a balsam poplar up north. You could consider planting a swamp white oak. You could consider planting bur oak, maybe white pine, maybe a tamarack, all kinds of options. Down the road in the metro area, I think about 5 years from now, if you're walking around and you see in kind of in a natural area, if you see a healthy looking ash tree and all the other ash trees have died, that would be something where you might want to report that. So at this point in time, it's too early in Minnesota to report surviving ash, but at some point we'll get there. And we'll probably put on the DNR Forest Health Emerald Ash Borer website, we would put directions on how to report those ash. Okay, so I'm gonna check the time here. Yeah, I'm just gonna review here a little bit. Take home points. Back to the drought. It's killed over the last couple years, even in the metro. I think going back to 2021, I started noticing shaded oaks in like natural areas dying. They were dying from two-line chestnut borer, and two-line chestnut borer only is going to kill oaks that are really stressed. So there are a lot of oaks dying across Minnesota right now, really from drought. Watering trees will protect them from a native root disease that is notorious for killing all kinds of tree species when they're really drought stressed. So if you properly water your mature trees, you might prevent that. You also might prevent attack by insects, native insects that usually only are a problem with severe drought or severe stress. So consider that. There's a website right there. It's a DNR website that gives a little video on how to water trees, young trees and old trees alike. I know University of Minnesota Extension has a really good website too on how to water mature trees. With oaks, the main point with oaks and oak wilt is don't wound oaks April through July, because that's the time when the stars align, the fungus is out, the spores are out, the beetles that carry the spores are out, and the oaks are actually susceptible to infection during that time frame. If you see an oak, particularly a red oak, that drops all of its, like 90% of its leaves in about a month, that almost for sure is oak wilt. On white and bur oaks, if you're wondering what's going on, you think it could be oak wilt, I highly recommend sending a sample to the plant disease clinic to get it confirmed, because white and bur oaks, it's just, there's a lot of lookalikes with oak wilt on white and bur oaks. Dutch elm disease, this is what Dutch elm disease looks like. If you have scattered flagging branches and the trees dying over the course of the summer and you see streaking on a symptomatic branch on the wood surface, that's Dutch elm disease. Various city elm management programs around the United States and actually Canada have been quite successful at maintaining boulevard elms. So rapid removal and disposal of dying elms can go a long way in kind of protecting the greater landscape against Dutch elm disease. And so Minneapolis, I know, has had a pretty successful program over the years. With emerald ash borer, it's a very difficult critter to detect because symptoms don't show up for a couple years. By the time symptoms show up, oftentimes it's too late to treat. You can treat an infested ash if basically less than 25% of its crown is impacted, is dying. I believe the industry standard in the tree care industry, arborists, they'll still treat those trees that have 25%, maybe even 33% or less symptoms. But ideally, you would, if you're going to hire somebody to treat an ash, you would want to treat it ideally before infestation. And that's the chemical that is quite effective at protecting against emerald ash borer. If you like to travel in anywhere, if you like to go camping, hunting, if maybe got a friend up north with a cabin, whatever, maybe you have a cabin up north, please keep your firewood in the county. Oak wilt, so I worked for 7 years in northern Wisconsin. I confirmed oak wilt for the first time in like 3 counties up there at the time. They all were started in cabin country in lakes, around lakes, almost definitely because somebody brought up oak firewood from an area further south that had oak wilt. So emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, oak wilt, they all move around on firewood. So just keep it at home. You can buy certified firewood. It has a stamp like this on it from the Minnesota Department of Ag. The Minnesota Department of Ag runs a firewood certification program. That firewood, it's treated in a way and it can't spread these bad actors. So there you go. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the invite. I'll stick around for questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. We do have a few questions in the chat. First from Joe Sandbakken, is the beetle from Asia? So this is with EAB. Is the beetle from Asia? And do they not have an issue with it there? If not, what is the predator for them there? And is that not an option here? And then woodpeckers can't keep up with them, I guess.
Yep, so that's a great question. So emerald ash borer is from Far Eastern Asia. Korea, China, I think it might even get into Mongolia. And yes, it's not a big problem there. So actually emerald ash borer, it's closely related to two-line chestnut borer. And it behaves the same way in its native habitat as two-line chestnut borer does here. So two-line chestnut borer, it's this native cambium borer of oaks. It only causes big problems if the oaks are really, really, really stressed. So that's the same can be said for emerald ash borer in its home, in its homeland. There are insects that are natural enemies of emerald ash borer over in Eastern Asia. And for decades now, there has been a program run by the federal government that has gone over. They've found 3 to 4 insects over there. They're actually very tiny wasps. They brought them over here. They've had them in a secure research facility to analyze if they're a threat to our natural environment. They've determined that no, they're not. And so there is a national program where they're releasing these native or these enemies of emerald ash borer, and Minnesota Department of Agriculture has released I believe 3 species of insect biocontrol agents of emerald ash borer in Minnesota. And it's not a silver bullet solution. But in my opinion, it's about the best thing that the government can do is to reintroduce an insect to that hurts emerald ash borer. We actually have native insects here that also will feed on emerald ash borer. And in some cases, birds actually do put a serious dent in emerald ash borer populations at a very small scale. And so there is no silver bullet solution, but all of these, the biocontrol effort over time, it might help.
And I answered one chat, but if Jared is still around, about Accolade elm. So Accolade elm is a hybrid elm, so it's not going to have the same issues as a pure American elm strain. So it does have great resistance to Dutch elm disease, and it just needs to be kept watered and pruned. And you'll have a healthy tree for a very long time. And to Michelle, we will be covering some plant dysfunction issues, and we may be covering maple issues during that. They do have a couple of issues that we would cover during that session. So, and that leads me into a plug for our for these sessions. Our next session is going to be May 23rd, and it is going to be a tree planting and selection webinar. Just like this, and we are going to be joined by researchers from the University of Minnesota, and they're going to help explain the different stock types and the different planting options for those stock types and proper planting. Yeah, so that should be good. I can put this link to the flyer in the chat as well. And does anybody else have any further questions for Brian? Well, I just want to thank you so much, Brian. This is so informative, and it's we're lucky as Minnesotans to have you leading the charge out there. So thank you
Thanks,
very
Dustin.
much.
I appreciate the invite.
All right. Well, I hope to see you all again in May, and we're going to go over proper tree planting and tree selection. So thank you very much.